because man's task is to make the earth after the model of heaven. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Man's project is to heavenize the earth. Man is made to transform the world from glory to glory, to take hold of it and break it down and remake it after the image of heaven.
What's up, everybody? Grant here from Take Hold Studios. On this special episode, I wanted to share with you a rerun of a time that we were privileged to interview pastor and author Douglas Wilson about a theology of war, or a Christian's perspective on war. This is about 3 years old, from 2018, but it was so good we figured we want to re-release it out to you guys. We have a whole lot of different listeners in the year 2021, and so we wanted to share this again and bless you guys with it. I hope you enjoy. Without any further ado, here's the interview we did with Pastor Doug Wilson. All right. Well, tonight we have Pastor Doug Wilson on Awakening Reformation podcast. Thank you so much for joining us, Doug.
Great to be with you.
Some of our listeners may not know who you are and what you do. So if you wanted to take a few minutes and introduce yourself and let the listeners know.
Sure. Here are some basic details. I just turned 65
Happy birthday.
A week or two ago. Yeah, thank you. And I live in the chimney of Idaho, in the panhandle that runs up toward Canada. So I live in the northern part of Idaho. I've been the pastor of Christ Church here for over 40 years. Before that, I was a philosophy student, and before that, I was in the submarine service of the United States Navy. So, happily married to Nancy Wilson, and we've had 3 kids. They all live here in Moscow, and between our 3 kids, we have 17 grandkids.
That's awesome.
So Erica and I have read quite a bit of your books as well as your wife's books.
Mm-hmm.
We enjoy listening to your sermons every week and the various YouTube videos that Canon Press, as well as the podcast.
Yep.
We really enjoy your ministry. We've benefited greatly from it. And I think probably in the last year, our theology has changed a lot and has become more reformed. And just want to thank you for being very influential in that. And it's been such a blessing.
Well, you're welcome, and thanks for paying attention.
So, relative to the topic we want to talk about, I am a chaplain assistant in the Army.
Uh-huh.
We have gotten several questions from friends, from family throughout the last several years that I've been in the Army. A lot of them are asking us about a biblical basis, or basically what a Christian should think about war. Is it a godly endeavor, or is it always against God's design for human flourishing? How would you answer that question?
Okay, so it's obviously, since wars are complicated subjects, addressing it from a Christian perspective is not going to be a simple 1, 2, 3, and then that will answer all your questions forever. Mm-hmm. But the historic Christian tradition, which I believe is rooted in Scripture, is the tradition that holds to what is called just war theory. So, what that means is that wars, like every other human endeavor, can be lawful, can be unlawful. It depends on the circumstances, and it depends on how you conduct yourself. It depends on why are you going to war. Are you at war because the space aliens invaded? That's a simple, okay, that would be okay to fight in that circumstance. Are you at war with Canada because you were greedy for all their timber and fish and invaded, right? So if you're just conducting an international smash and grab run, then obviously the war would be unlawful. If you are simply defending yourself from marauders, it would be lawful. So then the question is, since you've got lawful forms of war and unlawful forms of war, you then have to figure out where the boundary is between the two.
Would you say, as a post-millennial kind of theonomist, does your eschatology influence any part of how you would determine what would be a just form of war or maybe a wicked form of war?
Yeah, I think it. am post-mill and I am theonomic with a small t, and it would be the theonomy affects the question of war more directly than the post-millennial aspect does,
right.
Although both affect it. Theonomy is simply short for God's law, and since we believe that we are to be mindful of God's law in everything that we do, that would include when we go to war. I would think that it would include especially when you go to war. Mm-hmm. So if there's ever a time when I should be mindful of what God tells us to do and not do, it should be when I've got lethal weapons in my hands. I need to remember that God is God and that I am not God. And so understanding and being well versed in what the Bible teaches would be essential as you go to war. The eschatology would figure into this a little obliquely, but I think it does relate. The history of the human race is, by and large, a history of war. Mm-hmm. You know, we've been fighting the whole time. And if you believe that God's kingdom is advancing and progressing throughout human history, you believe that that's happening despite all the fighting, mm-hmm. and sometimes it's advancing because of the fighting.
Yeah, true. So with what you said about there being, you know, a just way to do war and an unjust way, how will then a Christian or a non-Christian view war, and then what is that thing that makes them view it differently? Okay, the first thing, if a Christian wants to think biblically about this as he ought to, that's the first thing that's going to set him apart. The non-believer, the non-believing soldier or sailor or airman, you know, who doesn't have anybody senior to him other than his commanding officer, right? Mm-hmm. The Christian has to remember God, and the person who has no God is basically at the mercy of the general or the admiral. So the Christian goes into a warfare situation under the authority of someone, God, who's not in the chain of command. Yeah. You know, someone who's senior to the Pentagon, someone who's senior to the White House. Yeah. Okay? Yep. So that means that there are certain things for the believer that will be simply off the table. He's not going to do that. And this leads to a distinction that has to be made at the front end. Once you're talking to Christians, you have to distinguish between. I'm going to give you a couple of Latin phrases. Go for it. Jus, J-U-S, jus ad bellum, justice with regard to going to war, and jus in bello, justice in the conduct of war. So jus ad bellum has to do with what are the biblical criteria for those who are making the decision to go to war. Mm-hmm. Okay, if Congress is considering whether to declare war, or the decision makers have to deal with jus ad bellum. The average soldier or sailor has to make decisions about jus in bello. That has to do with your conduct in the course of war. So let's say you're just a private in the jungle fighting somewhere, and your commanding officer tells you to massacre the villagers. Okay? Mm-hmm. You have to say no. You have to say no, because that would be an injustice in bello. And the lowliest foot soldier is in a position to make that determination. He was just told to murder some people, and he should say no. Okay? The average foot soldier is not in a position to get a PhD in geopolitics to figure out what on earth is going on in Yemen before he's ordered to go there. Okay? Mm-hmm. So the jus ad bellum criteria that Augustine famously developed, what are the questions you have to answer before you go to war? Is it a proportionate response? Is there an adequate hope of victory? Is the cause just? Things like that. Those are not questions that the rank and file enlisted man has to answer. So I've noticed on social media when American politicians and leaders strike somewhere in the world, usually there's some sort of uproar, and it's always the people acting like they have that PhD in geopolitics. Do you have any comments on that, and how we can kind of either use the Word of God to handle those kinds of situations as we see the news?
Yeah. Basically, the internet has not made us wiser. The internet just enables us to move our ignorance around the world at high rates of speed. We should be a lot more cynical about what we see people pronouncing on. President so-and-so did this because of oil. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
You don't know that.
Yeah.
How could you possibly know that? Right? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So it's like, for the last 20 or 30 years, I've been watching the left say about Middle East conflict, no blood for oil, no blood for oil, no blood for oil, because they've said that everything in the Middle East, we're there because we want their oil. And so if someone says, okay, let's come back, let's check out of the Middle East and let's drill for oil here, let's go up to Alaska and drill, baby, drill. Then all of a sudden, the left is yelling and hollering about that. Well, wait a minute. If you think that it's been a lust for oil that's been driving us to conquer the Middle East, then wouldn't it be wonderful if we went up and got our oil from Alaska? Well, apparently not. So basically, I think that many people handle international geopolitics very simplistically, and they are very dogmatic at the breakfast table or very dogmatic on Facebook. And I just think we need to read a book.
The few years I've been in the Army here and just sitting in certain meetings and being in the room, the more I know, the more I realize I don't know, and how much more there is to know about everything the military does. And maybe from your submarine time, you would resonate with that.
Oh, yeah, that's absolutely correct. So I'm locked up in a metal tube 400 feet down. And I'm doing math problems in the dark. I was in the navigation department when we were at battle stations. Okay. There is no conceivable way for me to understand the geopolitical justice or injustice of what our mission was. And fortunately, that's not my circus, not my monkeys, right? I don't need to know that. I do need to know that if I'm taken, if we wound up taking a prisoner and I was told to torture him to get information out of him, I know that that's contrary to the Geneva Conventions. I know that that's contrary to the Universal Code of Military Justice. Mm-hmm. I know that I'm being commanded to do an unlawful thing. So I must disobey. And as C.S. Lewis said, Christian military men who were prepared to disobey an order they knew for a fact to be unlawful would have much more of an impact on the overall tone of the military than everybody setting up as a private general or admiral.
So
that's awesome.
Would you say then there are good reasons for preemptive war? And if so, what would you say maybe some really good justifiable reasons would be? Right.
So, and I assume that you're talking about preemptive strike,
right,
where
yeah.
you hit first.
Yeah, based on some kind of intel or something like that. Well, we better strike before they do.
Sure. I would say that, yes, a preemptive strike is consistent with just war theory, but you need to be really sure of your facts.
Yeah.
Okay? Basically, if your neighboring country has got tanks mobilized on the border, and it's really easy to see that they're going to strike you within a week. That they're saber rattling, they're making threats, they're doing that kind of thing. I would say it's most certainly legitimate to strike first. But I would say if they're being that foolish, that belligerent, it would be far better to take a preemptive action, not a preemptive opening of the hostilities, right? Do something to spike their guns, not to necessarily to open fire on your own. But I do think a preemptive strike, if the facts are clear, is legitimate.
Awesome. Okay, taking all this in, what, for a Christian thinking about their nation going to war, serving in the military, what would the desired outcome be?
Okay, so this is a fantastic question, and it is one that has been neglected for a generation or more. As it happens, my dad wrote a book called Principles of War, and my dad was a graduate of the Naval Academy, and he went to the Naval War College, and he then took the principles of war that he learned of military warfare, objective, surprise, economy of force, concentration, and he applied them to strategic evangelism, right? So I've grown up in the household of someone who knew how to think in terms of principles as opposed to methods, okay? So let me take the example of the Vietnam War.
Okay.
And contrast it with World War II. In World War II, Congress declared war, and the objective was victory. All right. What should be the desired outcome of war? Well, peace because of victory, not peace because of a defeat, but peace because of victory. And you want to have fought in such a way that, number one, you win, and number two, you don't come out of the war with a bad conscience because of the tactics you used or the weapons you used. So you want victory with honor. That's the desired outcome of a war. Now, what we did in Vietnam is because, it started this way in the Korean conflict also. In the Second World War, we wanted the total surrender of Japan and Germany. Unconditional surrender. And we fought until we got that unconditional surrender. Okay? In Vietnam, it was never quite clear to anybody what the objective was. Okay?
Yeah.
And if you don't know what the objective, if the objective had been what it ought to have been in Vietnam, it would be to take Hanoi. All right? To overthrow North Vietnam and to win the war. That should have been the objective. But because we were fighting for political reasons, and it was the first televised war where people were seeing action on the evening news, what then happened is, because we didn't have a clear defined objective, the objective turned into something that you could count, right? And that's how commanders started thinking in terms of body counts. So more of the enemy were killed today than our guys were killed. But that makes no sense militarily. You could lose more men and win a battle in the old way of understanding, and you could come out unscathed and lose the war. So I even heard recently that some commanders in Middle East conflict within the last generation were judging success based on how fast they were burning through their budgets and how much money they were spending. If you don't have the objective of taking the enemy's capital city and winning the war and having them surrender, then it's going to twist off into some other demented kind of objective. So the outcome should be victory with honor.
Do you see the same absence of objectivity today in the current conflicts the U.S. finds itself in?
Yes, I would say so, particularly during the Obama era.
Okay.
There was a striking difference in since the election of President Trump. He turned over decision making to the battlefield commanders, and it's pretty hard to ignore what the objective ought to be if you're on the battlefield and you're leading men into battle. But if you have to basically, this is the difference. I would say you want your wars to be run by the warriors. You don't want your wars to be run by the lawyers or the politicians.
That's good.
So if you have to call back to Washington, we've got a column of terrorists traveling across Afghanistan and you have to call back to the Pentagon and they have to review it, run it past a panel of lawyers, and then you've got to call the chairman of various committees in Congress. That's not military thinking at all. It's political thinking. It's people who are just trying to cover their rear end back in Washington. You do not want to kill people for political reasons.
Yeah, exactly. That's really good. So when you have the soldier on the ground, he's lost a real objective here. What role does having a foundation like God's Word play in that sort of situation?
Yeah, a Christian should always know why he is where he is. A Christian always has a mission.
Yeah.
Even if the Army or Navy that he's involved in has lost their mission, he still has his. And that mission is to glorify God, do a good job, evangelize your fellow soldiers or sailors. I used to say, I said before I was in the navigation department, I used to say the Navy thinks I'm here to plot dots on a map, on a chart. That's why they think I'm here. And I'm going to do that job. But I've got other reasons for being here. And those other reasons would involve the advancement of the kingdom of God.
Yeah, they probably wouldn't like that answer, but it's a good one. It's a good Christian one.
Right.
Because I know I could be reprimanded pretty heavily if I'm caught, quote-unquote, proselytizing. But I have a great commission to obey anyway.
Yeah, exactly. And if you don't want someone proselytizing, why do you have chaplains?
Good question.
What's the point? So basically, one of the things you have to keep in mind is that the military has become a great experimental part of society for experiments in social engineering, because everybody has to obey, and discipline for ungodly reasons can be more strictly enforced than they can outside. And so consequently, conservative chaplains, conservative believers have oftentimes gotten into trouble more quickly or more severely than people who are behaving in a very ungodly way.
Yeah. What would be your answer to someone who is trying to use Jesus' commands there in Matthew to turn the other cheek as, a reason to not join the military or that we shouldn't go to war?
For pacifism.
They're trying to say, hey, we really should turn the other cheek and that sort of thing.
Yeah. There's a great essay, I'd quote him again, Why I'm Not a Pacifist by C.S. Lewis. Very, very fine essay. And he covers that, he treats that passage very well. And that is, you can't take the statements like that out of their original context. That's not talking about one general and another general. It's talking about quarreling villagers. Jesus is talking. So, do I believe if I'm just doing my business day to day here in a state of peace, and someone walks up to me and says, "You Jesus freak," and slaps me, I should not throw down my Bible and start fighting with him. Yeah. That passage, turn the other cheek, means exactly what it says. I should turn the other cheek. I should a soft answer turns away wrath. I should overcome evil with good. I should, so that's clear. And it's clear that Jesus is talking about life in a realm where people ask to borrow things, where people get into a spat, that sort of thing. Jesus is not saying, if someone asks you for something, help, go the extra mile to help them out. That means if somebody runs by you and then a minute later an axe murderer with a crazed look on his face runs up to you and says, "Which way did he go?" You shouldn't, because Jesus said, "Help him find the guy." Right? You have a responsibility to interfere with the axe murderer who's chasing the guy, but that's clearly taken it into another realm other than what Jesus had in mind. I believe that we need to just obey what Jesus said to do in the realm where he said to do that. But warfare was not part of that.
That's great. Thanks so much for coming on.
Well, my pleasure. Happy to do it.
If you want to plug anything or tell people how they can find resources from you, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Sure. Just a couple things. I have a blog where I contribute regularly, dougwils.com, dougwils.com. And there's a menu tab where you can find your way to a lot of the books I've written, books up top. And then Canon Press publishes a lot of my books. So canonpress.com also.
There's an app, too, for his blog for all those listening, and it's awesome.
Oh, good.
Thank you so much, Pastor Douglas Wilson. Again, we've benefited greatly, and we really appreciate you spending some time with us and helping us talk about this topic.
Great to be with you. Appreciate it.
All right, that was the interview. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope that it was beneficial to you in helping you think through a Christian's perspective on war and what a theology of war really looks like. And anyway, if you didn't already, like the video, subscribe to the channel so that you can continue to get awesome content like this. Guys, we have a merch store up too, so go to the link in the description below and check out a lot of the things that we have. It's not just our logo. We got a lot of Christian apparel and merchandise for you, and we hope that you pick some stuff up. It would really help us out. So anyway, until next time, this has been a Take Hold Studios production.
But on the basis of grace and on the finished work of Jesus Christ, the project is back and forth, and the destiny of a new transformed world is assured.